Some games end up on this program because their ambitions outstrip their resources. Some games end up here because they fit a very specific niche in an odd and hard to market way. And some games I cover, well, they're just a bit shit. But another common path into my bargain bin of history is the one walked by games that started off as one thing and came out the end as something else entirely. And such is the case for the Bureau XCOM Declassified. Initially revealed as just XCOM and positioned as the return of the much vaunted 90s PC strategy called Classic, it was somewhat infamously met with derision. Changing up the genre to a dark and brooding first-person shooter angered original fans, and in an era dominated by gritty gray corridors viewed at the end of a gun barrel, there was worry it would be yet another derivative cash-in on a beloved franchise. Before long, though, the fans were placated when a more faithful strategy-focused XCOM reboot was eventually revealed as a sister title, the XCOM Enemy Unknown of 2012 that has since become gaming royalty. The surprise blockbuster success of that title, though, and a ton of internal strife at 2K Australia and Marin, ended up leading to dramatic changes for what would now become the Bureau XCOM Declassified. The game was reimagined and retooled into a squad-based third-person shooter, and had its tone and art style hew closer to the strategic smash hit, becoming somewhat lighter and incorporating more of the series' staple creatures and weaponry. And personally, I have always mourned the death of the original vision for that title, especially because it was more than just a few scraps of concept art revealed too early. It got to the point in development where it was being actively previewed to press, and the things I heard out of those early previews really excited me at the time. They gave whispers of a tense, smaller scale shooter, though still having those franchise favorite base management research aspects that took you to the ground floor of an alien invasion in some of the most disturbing ways possible, mixing classic sci-fi themes with a bit of existential body horror and a direly oppressive atmosphere corrupting the 1950s suburban setting. The small snippets of it I saw and the anecdotes coming out from behind closed door showings lit my brain alight. I didn't care that it had a grimmer tone than the original games. To be honest, I didn't play them when they were new anyways, as I was brought up on consoles. And while more cinematic shooters of that sort were certainly starting to get overplayed, even by 2010 when XCOM was first revealed, there was a lot that could still be done with the genre, especially within the very intimate sort of context they looked to be aiming for. But, whether I like it or not, the Bureau is what we got instead, and it was absolutely unfairly stigmatized as a result. Shunned by people like me, who wanted the original vision it replaced, and by both old and new XCOM fans who didn't like how it ran counter to what they felt the series was in terms of design, many treated it as just a cheap cash grab that was only making it to release at this point due to the sunk cost fallacy. The truth of the matter is, though, that while it is far from perfect and a confused game in many ways to say the least, it wasn't simply a brazen attempt to pilfer fans' pockets. After giving it a fair try, it's clear there is some genuine love behind this one, and some solid fun to be had once you open up to what it's trying to do. But before we get into things proper, and I do my normal extensive autopsy of what this game ended up being, I think we need to talk a little bit more about this game's development and set up some context. We might as well start from the very beginning, back in 1994, with the launch of UFO Enemy Unknown, or as it was called here in North America, XCOM UFO Defense. This first game in the franchise was a massive hit for Microprose back in the day, selling over 500,000 copies, which in 90s PC gaming numbers is huge. It was also a critical darling, winning over fans and reviewers alike with its deep strategic gameplay and era-appropriate alien theming, keeping in mind that the X-Files had debuted only a year prior. Naturally, it was followed up with a number of different sequels, expanding upon the mechanics and the lore, but none of them managed to hit quite as hard as the first game did. In fact, the last Microprose published title in the franchise, XCOM Interceptor, which added flight sim elements as you can guess from the title, only sold about 30,000 copies. So we cut to the turn of the millennium, and we see Microprose get acquired by Hasbro Interactive, the incredibly ill-conceived software branch of the famous toy manufacturer. As expected from a brand like Hasbro, they wanted to market the absolute ever-loving fuck out of XCOM, with toys and comics and a cartoon show and just all sorts of other stuff. But that never happened, because the .com bubble that had convinced Hasbro to expand into gaming in the first place was already in the process of bursting. They did at least manage to release 2 games in the series under their label before it all came tumbling down though, and shockingly neither are any good. The first was a dumbed-down play-by-email affair, simply called XCOM, and the second was a bizarre and extremely 5th-gen feeling third-person shooter called XCOM Enforcer. Enforcer was definitely the more egregious of the two, as it had almost nothing to do with XCOM as a whole, incorporating basically none of the series' staple gameplay elements, and ultimately being little more than a confused sectoid shooting gallery. Honestly, perhaps that explains why series diehards were so wary of then seeing the franchise rebooted as anything other than a strategy game. And to their chagrin, for a long time, Enforcer was where the XCOM story ended. That is, until a new saga started surrounding the ideation and development of the game we're talking about here today. That tale begins in 2005, when Take-Two Interactive finds themselves in the ownership of the XCOM IP, after having bought Infogrames, who had themselves bought the festering corpse of Hasbro Interactive several years prior. The 2000s were wild for this sort of business bloodsport nonsense. Not long after that, in 2006, Take-Two also bought Ken Levine's Irrational Games, who they had been working with for a couple of years at that point on the development of BioShock. As it so happens, that studio wanted to take on work on a secondary project as well, so both the Boston and Australian Irrational Games teams pitched their own respective ideas for an XCOM revival. Boston's would have been a strategy affair, somewhat rooted in their previous Freedom Force games, but they had a BioShock to focus on, so the leadership of the XCOM project went to the Australian team, who was then spun off into their own new studio, 2K Australia. Their vision was the one I mentioned back in the intro, a tense, single-player, first-person shooter set in the 1950s and featuring Cold War theming, an unknowable existential alien force, and a heavy dash of X-Files to bring it all together. This version of the project clearly had a lot of potential, and seeing that, Take-Two assigned 2K Marin to it as well, both as a support studio and to help get some sort of multiplayer in there. After all, it's now 2010 and this was a AAA project, so per the order of the day, it needed to have something it could use to justify an online pass. And Marin did make a lot of sense for this, as they were responsible for BioShock 2, which, despite being made with some disagreement from the original team at Irrational, definitely fit into a similar mold to what 2K Australia were building. Unfortunately, the two teams had trouble working together, both due to differences in time zone, but also of opinion. Take-Two tried to resolve this by merging the two studios and having them work closer together, but those struggles remained. While all of this is going on, a demo is prepared, and shown behind closed doors at E3 2010, those very same demos I was so excited about. And while many of the press previews were positive, as I mentioned, the overall reception was quite polarized. Cut to a year later, in 2011, and the creative leads at 2K Australia have left the company, leading to Marin now becoming the primary developer on the game. This is where things shift dramatically, and the game really stops being XCOM and becomes The Bureau. With 2K Marin now exerting more control over development, they changed up the design to be more conventional and linear, the alien threat less beyond comprehension, and they change up the perspective from first to third person. This is also when the setting changes from the 1950s to the 1960s, which was part of a subtle but very meaningful change to the game's overall tone and themes. Similar to how they had done in 2010, a demo is then prepped with these changes for E3 2011, and it's received much more warmly. This leads to Take-Two allowing 2K Marin to retool the game as a whole, changing it from a reboot of the series to instead a link between the old Microprose games and the new one being made by Firaxis. Unsurprisingly though, this sort of extensive revamp was an excessive amount of work, and there were still struggles behind the scenes between 2K Marin and the remaining 2K Australia team, which led to 2K Australia eventually being removed from the project and largely being shifted to work on BioShock Infinite instead. With the ball now being entirely in 2K Marin's court, they hurriedly plowed forward to release, with an increasingly impatient Take-Two looking over their shoulder, as they had since missed multiple milestones and their originally slated March 2012 release date. That then takes us to August 2013, when the game is finally kicked over the finish line, now a much different beast from how it was originally conceived, and in the shadow of a very successful older brother in the form of 2012's XCOM Enemy Unknown. Now, hearing this story, it's very easy to think of 2K Australia as the victim, having their game basically stolen out from under them by 2K Marin and having to watch it be transformed into something else entirely, but I don't think that's strictly fair. AAA development has always been cutthroat, and especially on a known IP like this, publishers are always going to shift things around however they can to mitigate any perceived risk. Factor in things like the initial public reaction in 2010 and the creative leads leaving the studio in 2011, and it's easy to see why 2K wouldn't stick to their guns and try to force that original vision through to the end. Do I still lament the game being retooled top to bottom? Absolutely. I will always mourn that original concept, as it really did speak to me. But that said, 2K Marin's work still deserves to be judged on its own merits. So let's play through it, this time with a decade's emotional distance, and see how it holds up. We start off in the midst of a conclave of government officials, clandestinely meeting in a secret facility in Groom Range, Nevada, and discussing a recently intercepted message of unknown origin. While the prime suspect is of course the Soviets, it's 1962 after all, they're the expected guilty party for any shady business, one of the group, a man named Falk, is convinced it's another entity that he's been investigating, known as the Outsiders. He brings this up to the table's chagrin, as the Outsiders are a specter that Falk's been annoyingly chasing for years, but this time those extraterrestrial ghost stories come with some backing, as a strange device far beyond Ivan's tech level has recently been found hidden in a mine. Falk has brought the device here to this meeting, under guard by an FBI agent named William Carter, who we actually see driving in with it during the game's opening splash screens, and it's at this point he calls for Carter to be brought in. We then cut to another room where we see the man slumped on the floor and hip deep in the bottle, all while the strains of Buddy Holly's That'll Be the Day dulcetly croon out and set the tone. A woman then knocks on the door and comes into the room, ostensibly there to bring him to the meeting, but first asking if he'd opened the ominous briefcase he's been ordered to watch. She then goes to open it herself, and when Carter tries to stop her, she shoots him in the shoulder and sends him reeling to the floor. The case then starts to glow, and she smashes it open, at which point a blinding light pours out and fills the room. Carter gets up to try and stop her, but when she turns around, her eyes have become a blood red, and a sickly black oil is weeping from her face. Clearly, this woman is something more than a simple Soviet double agent, as she then drags Carter to the balcony and strangles the life out of him, the screen fading to white as he loses consciousness. It's not the end though, as before long he comes to. Buddy Holly still blaring in the background, but the scene has changed dramatically. The room is now a ruin, the woman who tried to kill him burnt to a crisp on the floor, and the briefcase has mysteriously vanished, but seemingly not stolen. Carter feels oddly different, and somehow his gunshot wound has healed completely, and he believes the now missing briefcase has something to do with that. There's not much time to ponder the situation though, as while he was out, the entire base seems to have been attacked, with there being signs of combat and destruction everywhere, thanks to an unknown force bombarding the facility from every angle. Ducking through the debris and trying to get his bearings, Carter eventually makes his way outside, and quickly runs into the enemy face to face, giving us an introduction to the de facto XCOM series mascot, the Sectoid. A group of them is in pursuit of another agent, and packing his good old 1911, Carter steps in to lend a hand. As in every other XCOM game, they're not much of a threat in such small numbers and go down pretty easily, letting Carter meet up with Nils, his grateful fellow agent. Grabbing a radio, the two then learn that Falk is still on base and in the sublevel of a nearby warehouse, so Carter and Nils set off to rendezvous with him and his team, as well as learn the basics of combat along the way. On its face, the Bureau is a pretty typical tactical third-person shooter of the sort you'd see every now and again in the 7th gen, with the most obvious parallel being Mass Effect 2 and 3. Working in very much the same way as the latter two of BioWare's sci-fi RPG series, combat in the Bureau sees you going shoulder to shoulder with two squad mates who you can order to take cover and focus fire, with positioning and flanking being a key factor to how encounters play out. In fact, as time goes on, you and your squad will even start getting special abilities that you select and pop off via a slowed down tactical overlay that becomes a cornerstone of the gameplay, just like Mass Effect. That said, despite the obvious similarities, to call it simply Mass Effect with fedoras would be extremely reductive and disingenuous. That's because the Bureau's take on this particular shooter format is actually quite nuanced, something I'll get into more later on in the video, with it being very clear even from the start that proper squad tactics and cleverly adapting to changes in the field are the key to success here, rather than simply hammering out DPS or turtling up behind cover. Mind you, it does take quite some time for this game to grow into that nuance and fully show you everything in its toy box, so I can understand why a lot of people made the comparison I just did based on their first impressions, with the Bureau honestly coming off worse for it. Anyways, we'll talk more about the gameplay later on after it's opened up a bit more. But for now, just some basic cover shooting 101 is enough to get Carter and Nils past a few scattered sectoids and their outsider masters. Eventually making it to the warehouse and getting down to the basement, they meet up with Falk and his escort Kinney, who bring Carter up to speed on the situation, though just from the elevator ride down, we know that the base is irrevocably overrun. As for why they're hitting room range specifically, Nils had explained earlier when we got to the sub-basement that the government has been experimenting on the extraterrestrial element Illyrium down here, so it's a prime target. Of course, so was that mysteriously now missing briefcase that Carter was escorting, which he lets Falk know the skinny on, both about the woman who tried to steal it and his curiously healed wound. Falk is dismayed but rolls with the punches and lets Carter know that he's now working for the Bureau, as likely the entire chain of command has been hit in this invasion, with everyone up to the President potentially dead. With such dire straits, the plan for the moment is simply to get out of Dodge, escaping the base so they can regroup and figure out how to strike back. As such, Falk then sends Carter, Nils, and Kinney off to go collect the rest of the commanders we saw him talking with in the opening cutscene, while he hangs back here to secure the research he has on the outsiders. This sends Carter's crew through the bowels of the base, scrapping past a few more encounters with E.T.'s angry older brothers before encountering the most nightmarish thing of all: outdated physics particle effects that tank the frame rate. To be fair, for the most part, the Bureau runs pretty well on modern machines. It scales up to modern resolutions cleanly enough, doesn't throw a fit or conk out at launch, and doesn't yell about drivers or multiple monitors or any of the other common bugbears a decade-plus old software can run into. That said, some legacy physics code in there does like to cause problems, both big and small. The big one I ran into is that the version on Steam comes loaded with an outdated physics DLL that doesn't play nice with modern NVIDIA installations or potentially maybe Windows 11. As a result, it causes instability and crashes when the physics kicks up, but I've read it doesn't affect everybody. Thankfully, you'll find out pretty early on, because about 5 minutes into the game, you'll run into this room with a hanging biplane, which will reliably crash the game if your setup and that skunk bit of code aren't getting along. Luckily, it's also super easy to fix. Just delete the offending DLL, grab a fresh version from the most recent NVIDIA driver pack. If you've updated your drivers recently, you already have it on your PC, and then just whack it in and you're golden. That being said, while it will no longer crash, it will still run like trash when the particles really start to fly, and for whatever reason, you can't brute force it smooth with a shiny modern GPU. Turning off the extra physics settings entirely does seem to solve that problem though, and doesn't really affect the look of the game all too much, unless you just can't finish without seeing cloth ripple realistically. However, even with those NVIDIA issues ironed out, the Bureau overall still feels like it's being held together with duct tape. Mind you, it plays smooth enough, and it only ever crashed on me once, not even causing me to lose any progress when it did, but there's just a vibe to how it runs that makes it seem like it's barely holding together. It's generally something you don't see directly, most often manifesting as slightly odd AI behavior or somewhat janky transitions here and there, but you do feel it. And I did see it show its face properly once when a gear slipped and an enemy got caught in the environmental scenery, and I had to go hunting through the combat arena to try to find it, all while my squad mates stand around like chickens in the rain. For the most part though, the Bureau runs well enough, and the little bit of jank that's there doesn't get in the way, which for a game as old as this one is more than I can ask, especially considering some of the trials that I've gone through with other titles. But once you've turned off the physics settings and gotten past the frame-devouring Elerium reactor, Carter and his squad can finally make it to the war room, where they'll find one General Deems, alive but surrounded by corpses. He's evasive when asked what happened, brushing concerns aside and asking to be taken to fault, but before that can happen, he's gunned down by a woman hiding in the rafters. As it turns out, this is Falk's right-hand agent, Angela Weaver, and she explains that Deems was a traitor, infected with the same black ooze as the woman who tried to kill Carter earlier. After a quick chat to catch up and then finish off Deems, she heads off to join up with Falk and secure a helicopter for their evac, while Carter and his squad take a train to the test site to meet up with them. It's unclear why we couldn't all just go to the helicopter together, especially as splitting up when there's alien saboteurs running around the place seems like a terrible idea, but we do at least get to enjoy a couple fun set pieces as a result. Firstly, our little trip in the diesel shows how the Outsiders are dropping in their own Elerium reactors and using those as seeds to take over and terraform areas of interest, ripping apart the landscape in their wake. Arriving at the test site, we then hold the line for a little bit as we wait for the helicopter, after which we cover our escape with the second set piece by dropping a big old nuke, presumably much to the delight of any visiting tourists. Which, if you weren't aware, atomic tourism was a real thing in Nevada back in the 40s and 50s, with casinos having dedicated rooms and viewing areas to watch publicly scheduled nuclear bomb tests rip holes up in the Mojave. This is why the Stardust sign is shaped like that, not just being space-themed, but subtly referencing a whole lot more being vaporized than just your holiday budget at the tables. With the mushroom cloud behind us, Carter and the crew are able to escape to the Bureau of Operations and Command bunker, the HQ of a secret branch of the government meant to operate in the shadows to deal with threats coming from the stars. Initially spec'd for skeet shooting Sputnik out of the sky, the Outsider invasion has forced them to scale up dramatically, and ahead of schedule, with the Bureau calling in all the assets they can muster to defend against this new alien threat. Will is just one such asset, and upon his arrival, he's given a brief tour before meeting his new office mate, Nico Da Silva, an agent who's been running with the Bureau for a while now, and whose warm, casual attitude makes him and Carter fast friends. Their banter is cut short though, as Falk calls everyone into the ops room and gives a speech to the assembled staff laying out the current situation. We are at war, a nation wholly under fire, and no one is ready for it. The enemy overwhelmingly has the advantage. They have superior technology, they have superior numbers, and they took us by surprise in a way we never could have anticipated. In the short hours since they showed up, they have already thoroughly routed our traditional forces and toppled our command structure. That's why Falk and the Bureau are taking control of what little remains, as potentially the only authority left to do so. Originally founded to coordinate a resistance against a potential Soviet invasion, a greater force, a more insidious existential threat has arisen. And so is born XCOM. It's a stirring speech, doing a good job helping tie a very loose thread to the overall XCOM mythos, and before long, the threat reinforces itself close to home. That's because after a short rest, some more back and forth with Falk, and the opportunity to set up our squad, Will gets word from Nils that there's an infiltrator on the base. Nils has already chased them down to the morgue and calls in Carter for backup, but when Carter arrives, he finds Nils dead. His erstwhile assassin decloaks, and after a brief and unsettling tete-a-tete, Will and his team are forced into combat, taking down the infiltrator, but managing to bring him in alive for further interrogation and study. There's no time to rest, though, as Falk immediately calls Will back to Ops to be sent out on his first proper mission as part of XCOM. After a quick detour to talk with former Nazi scientist Dr. Dresner and get our Ven brace, a fancy bit of kit that will allow Will to use alien weaponry, we head off to meet the director to be debriefed. On the way, though, and across all of this running around we've been doing so far, there's been lots to see here in the base, and that's because the Bureau puts a lot of emphasis on this location. While it's not essential to gameplay the way it is in the other XCOM games, you're not doing research or building equipment here or anything like that, you end up spending a lot of time at the base, with the game using it to create atmosphere. Through various collectibles and side conversations with random staffers, a sense of tension is built up, and hints are given towards the larger scale of what's going on out there. Little of it is plot critical, and much can be ignored if you want to just keep moving, but what's there is generally compelling, and adds some very solid texture to both the human and later alien circumstances in this conflict. It can get a bit all tell, no show with them using the audio logs and the notes strewn around everywhere to explain away plot holes or cheat things into feeling grander than they are. But it does nicely imply that wider context of their story, without maybe having the budget or remaining dev time needed to fully realize those bigger ideas. Honestly, the most significant issue with this stuff is that there's maybe just too much of it. Between a dozen or so NPCs to regularly chat with, people's diary pages left out on every tabletop, and even a few very minor in-base side quests, you've got a laundry list of crap to poke at after every mission. And that's not even mentioning the story-critical faffing about that sees you running back and forth down these corridors so much that door guards must think Carter is just trying to get his steps in. All told, you can and will easily spend an hour or so between pretty much every major mission, running around the base's small handful of rooms. And while I love world building and tone setting as much as the next guy, after a certain point it does start to wear on you. But there is more to this game than just partaking in office drama, so let's move things back along and see about getting into the field. Meeting up with Falk, he gives us our marching orders, sending us off to Georgia to go retrieve a Dr. Alan Weir from Rosemont University. Weir is the foremost expert on machine languages, a prodigy of punch cards, and he is our best bet when it comes to reverse engineering the invaders' tech and turning it to our advantage. With the university currently under attack, it's clear the outsiders know that Weir's been analyzing the few scraps of alien HTML that we've managed to recover so far. So we need to get in there and rescue him so we can bring him back to base and get him working for XCOM directly. Arriving on the outskirts of Rosemont, we're told that AA guns are preventing the chopper from approaching the university, so Carter and his team have to go in on foot to shut them down. As they do, they get a horrifying lay of the land, seeing how the outsiders have taken a sleepy college town celebrating homecoming and turned it into a waking nightmare. Seemingly frozen in a grisly, oil-slick moment in time, the streets are strewn with corpses attending a silent parade, and those that aren't dead have been infected with that same black ooze, locked into repeating their last few sane moments in a facade of normalcy, set against an increasing level of devastation as the squad approaches the university. As was seen in our time back at the base, it's clear that properly setting up a sense of atmosphere was absolutely a key focus for the team making this game, and they've gone above and beyond with the little details to really immerse players into the world. Our walk down Main Street here really shows that, and it's the little things that truly evoke a sense of devastation, with lots of visual storytelling helping to give subtle, deeper glances into smaller moments of the conflict. It all goes a long way towards selling the world and making it feel lived in, creating a sense of place as you visit small towns and backwoods and see the remains of the greater fight and the toll it's taken on the populace. Now, that's not to say it's been done perfectly. The limitations of their budget and the back and forth dev cycle really do show under a bit of scrutiny. With a lot of this set dressing in particular, there's an inconsistency of quality, with some odds and ends being super sharp and well placed, and some just coming off as slapped together. Going back to the base, we can see examples of both of these extremes right across the hall from each other. To speak to the good side of it, in Weaver's office, we can see she has a custom rifle up on the wall that fits her character perfectly. We've already seen she has a predilection for Springfields, it has Artemis engraved on the stock, which mythology-wise is very much to her themes, and reading notes you find around, like with everything else, you can see that she has a background in competition shooting, with that prized rifle making that assertion more than just text. While it's a bit janky that it's just superglued up there and not on a rack or something, it's a nice little touch that makes the space feel less contrived. On the opposite end of things, though, we have all the degrees in Director Falk's office, and while I have no doubt that he is a college-educated fella, that doesn't explain why he needs 3 different identical Bachelor of Arts degrees, all from the same university. And while that lazy bit of copy-paste is disappointing, sadly even the assets that are custom and add to the world don't always meet up with the level of quality of Weaver's rifle, or even Falk's fly-by-night degrees. Just look at this fake magazine talking about Professor Weir. While I can appreciate that it was added and it helps sell the importance of the upcoming mission objective, it also just looks like it was dashed off on a lunch break to try to convince people that Weir is actually well known, and not just some kook tucked away in a small discredited Southern University's basement. But I'm nitpicking. Being fair here, they've put in far more effort into this atmospheric filigree than a lot of games would bother with, and they've done so consistently across the span of the game. While some of it may betray the limitations this game faced, the effort is still to be lauded. Those rough edges are also not something you're going to notice unless you go looking for them, as they do a good job obfuscating things and distracting you with visual effects that sell the bigger picture. In the grip of destruction, the fire and water effects look pretty good for the time, and don't tank the frame rate like those PhysX particles did. Back in the safety of the base, especially in the ops room, a fog of cigarette smoke lingers at all times, reinforcing both the tension of the situation and a time period where smoking indoors was the norm. Even little things like breaking glass clearly had some strong attention paid to them, to the point that the quality of their glass tech almost feels like feature creep on the part of some very ambitious coder, as you almost never see intact windows in this game to break. The animation team as a whole was also firing on all cylinders, as there are scads of small but meaningful animations throughout that really give a sense of Carter and his character. You see it in the deliberate way he clears a room whenever he enters into a combat area, the way he smokes a quick dart when idling, the way he tightens his jaw and impatiently fidgets when talking with people. All of this visually informs the character in a really strong way. And they do this for everyone. This is a game with a decent amount of hand-talking and gesturing, getting away from conversations just feeling like talking heads, which is important for a game that absolutely has more dialogue to show you than is strictly necessary. That's why it's so important that everyone got a bit of that animated character. They even gave it to your procedurally generated squad mates, with them going at ease in very natural ways when the situation calls for it. We see one such example of that as we continue on through Rosemont and find a bank with some survivors holed up in the vault. Taking advantage of this brief bit of downtime, Carter's crew finds a comfortable spot to get a breather in, all while Will chats with the locals and gets some more context for the plague we've seen, the one with the black ooze that causes people to repeat themselves. You can then have your helicopter pilot, Barnes, come and rescue these folks, but it doesn't really affect anything, and this whole bit is just to provide a break in the pace and to help flesh out our knowledge of what XCOM ends up calling the Sleepwalker virus. And that brief respite is appreciated, because by this point, after having already taken out the AA guns on the way here, we arrive at the university. Using this as a central base, the aliens have already started building up their own infrastructure, and knocking on the front door, we're greeted with our first muton. Making it inside after taking it down, we find Dr. Weir's assistant, Lawrence, collecting up the professor's research notes as Weir won't leave without them. The notes detail the duo's theory that teleportation is for all intents and purposes possible, and posits that's how the outsiders got here to Earth in the first place. That tech would be key to us fighting back, so Lawrence covertly takes the notes ahead to Weir to help him get all his research and gear ready for exfil. Meanwhile, Carter and his team work their way to the lab separately in order to draw the invaders' attention by going loud as possible as the combat starts to properly coalesce. That's because at this point in the game, you've got a proper squad, have unlocked a few weapons and abilities, and have started encountering more than just your garden variety sectoids and outsider grunts. As such, the training wheels are starting to come off, but things are still pretty nascent, and to be quite honest, this level and some of what follows are the gameplay at its least entertaining. While that promised tactical depth is there, it's just very limited in these opening hours, with the starting abilities of Carter and his crew being a bit uninspired, especially in combination with the limited opening weapon set you have before you start getting your hands on the aliens' tech. As such, strategy largely consists of just keeping an eye on positioning in these early moments, and then popping off your limited abilities more or less right away as they come off cooldown. At the very least, though, the tactical controls do feel intuitive, and there are some clever things you can do early on, such as having Carter lift a key enemy out of cover, and then having your recon unit, one of 4 specialized classes, use their starting ability to critically hit them. Overall, though, your starting tool set and the opportunities available to properly exploit it feel extremely sparse during these first few opening hours, and in a way that really hides what this combat can be when it's at its best. Unfortunately, the game isn't going to let you get past these initial doldrums without a fight either, as, at least on veteran difficulty, enemies are really spongy, so it takes a while to whittle down anything past the most basic of adversaries. This does recede somewhat later on as you get better weapons and better tactics open up, but in these early stages it can feel like a war of attrition. That isn't helped by the fact that said sponginess isn't shared by Will and his boys, so they'll go down quite frequently, and some tougher early encounters can just end up being a conga line of revives as you desperately try to keep everyone in the fight. And even worse, going down like that resets your ability cooldowns, so any plans you might have been trying to cook up get set back to square one as you and your crew hit the pavement. The one mitigating factor for all of this in these early stages is the fact that your weapons thankfully have some pretty decent feedback to them and a really great sense of impact, so while it may take a week to knock down a muton, it at least feels good to do so. It's even better with the smaller foes, as there you'll see some really solid hit reactions, and if you've got good aim or just get up nice and close, some surprisingly glorious headshots, which I did not expect from this game. One other thing you'll get a good idea of during these early encounters is the quality of your teammates' AI, for better and for worse. That's because while you do have that whole tactical menu to order your boys around with, outside of your commands, they will very much take the wheel, and do so with a shocking amount of independence. They'll revive each other and you without prompting, they'll take cover and attack foes of their choice, and they'll even try to slowly press forward when it makes sense to do so. They're not completely able to take on encounters by themselves though, as they won't use their special abilities without your say-so, and the choices the AI will make in regards to target priority and what constitutes good cover are sometimes a bit off-kilter. But their autonomy is impressive nonetheless, especially for the time. It does definitely feel like it's potentially pushing the limits of the engine though, hence some of those odd choices I mentioned that the AI makes, and the general idiot savant energy it seems to have, further lending to the strapped together with duct tape feel that the whole game emits. An obvious example there is when you do take control and ask your crew to pop off their special skills, with ranged abilities being designated with a marker that acts like a character in the world, being blocked off by obstacles, and needing to be walked upstairs, even though it's essentially just a cursor. It still works well enough, you can hit things with it, but it definitely feels weird and lends to the jankiness of the game overall. And you'll get a good sense of that jankiness and the eccentricities of combat overall as you push through the university grounds, taking on a few different arenas, unlocking your first alien weapon, and fighting a mini-boss in the form of your first sectopod, an intimidating spider mech piloted by an entombed sectoid. Make your way through all of that though, getting an eyeful of how the Outsiders are terraforming Rosemont along the way, and you'll finally make it to the observatory and Dr. Weir. There, you'll meet up again with Lawrence, who's helping Weir gather some final numbers as the aliens are in the midst of opening a portal right into the lab. As this happens, Lawrence tells you to take the Doctor and run, saying that Weir is the key to understanding something called Mosaic, and revealing that he'd been compromised all along with the Black Ooze, though seemingly not with the same malicious intent as we saw with General Deems and our assailant back at Groom Range. Cut to outside, and while Weir initially resists being rescued, wanting to stay with his work, his arguments are cut short by the arrival of an Outsider gunship that starts dropping off troops. It's a hell of a fight, especially this early on, but Carter and his crew manage to fend off the Horde and take down the gunship, successfully exfiltrating with Weir and returning back to base. Fading back into Will's office, we catch him listening to the radio and hearing about other military bases that are being taken over in the invasion. Just as he's starting to lose his temper at the existential futility of the situation, Weaver comes in and offers the best salve possible for an anxious mind: busy work. Specifically, a set of side quests that the game calls minor ops, and she forces you to go complete one before the main story will progress any further. Minor ops are exactly what it says on the tin: short little excursions out into the field to solve smaller, tertiary problems in between main missions. There's generally no real push to participate in these diversions outside of this first go at them, but I ended up doing them all anyways because they're probably my favorite part of the game. Being short, snacky, 20 to 30 minute chunks of gameplay, they feel nicely contained, and more in line with what I think of traditionally as the XCOM mission format. Funnily enough, I actually suspect that these were initially intended to be the main meat of the game in a much earlier design doc. Small alien events that your team gets sent out to deal with that are all largely disconnected but feed into gameplay progression until eventually a story mission unlocks. Rather than that though, here in the final product, they feel vestigial, because while they are a lot of fun and the upgrades you'll unlock by completing them are extremely useful, the rapid pace of the story means it always feels like there's bigger fish to fry while you're wasting time mucking about in some Iowan cornfield stopping random nukes. That dissonance doesn't stop them from being a damn good time though. Their smaller scope means they're a great excuse to sharpen your claws and really experiment with your tactics in ways you might not feel comfortable with while slogging through a main mission. I also really like the thin, basic premises all of these missions have, sending you off to do things like investigate a lumber mill about to be engulfed by a forest fire, stopping an alien fugitive escaped from a Bureau convoy, or dealing with those aforementioned corn-fed nukes. These sorts of engaging little B-stories, disconnected as they might be, help make it feel like you're a larger part of the war without bloating the overarching narrative. These minor ops don't get stale either, as they all happen in areas outside of those in the main campaign, so they're not simply a dumping ground of sets you've already seen, though there is some vicious asset reuse among them as they were clearly made with scraps. Limitations aside though, they're just good fun, and while the main missions or major ops aren't bad either, they are occasionally the veggies you must eat to get back to fucking around in side quests. To use a more thematically appropriate X-Files simile, these minor ops are the fun Monster of the Week episodes contrasting against the main missions, which are more along the lines of when the show would try to force us to care about Mulder's missing sister.
Where is she?
I don't care!
Aside from the major and minor ops though, you will see some other icons sitting on the mission board, so I might as well explain those now while I'm here. The first are simply news broadcasts, because despite the Bureau's comms team blocking media in pretty much every part of the country to try to prevent mass panic, some scattered local news is still getting out. Mechanically, these are just snippets of text, giving you some further, wider context for how the country is dealing with the alien threat. Nice to have, but not that interesting, and it's more tell, don't show, which I don't love. The other icons you'll see are dispatch missions, where you can send off members of Carter's team who aren't actively in the fight with him out on their own unseen adventures. They'll return by the time you finish whatever mission you were on, and when they come back, they'll have gotten a level or two under their belts and will generally have a shiny prize of some sort clenched in their teeth in the form of a new weapon, backpack, or freshly recruited and already leveled squad member. As such, it's always worth sending out your extra squaddies on these whenever you can, both so you can reap the rewards, and so they're well trained if they need to come and replace one of your other agents who's bit the farm. Speaking of which, after Carter returns from the cornfield with a cooler head, he's called up to engineering to meet with Falk, who reveals XCOM's grand plan to win this war. Knowing that simply trying to hold ground here on Earth is a fool's errand, we're instead betting it all on a strike directly against the enemy, using a prototype flying saucer to hit the alien homeworld. We need to know where their homeworld is though, and even more so how to get there, so Will is sent to the labs to interrogate the outsider infiltrator who killed Nils. Meeting with the captured invader, we find him distinctly more docile, as the implant that connected him to Mosaic, which it turns out is the alien's communication network, has been removed. According to Weir's research, Mosaic connects directly to the minds of each and every outsider, giving them orders and relaying information back to their mother base, meaning that dismantling Mosaic will be the key to winning this war. Of course, just because the mechanical shackles have been removed, it doesn't mean the mental ones have, and our outsider friend is still less than congenial and takes a condescending tone towards Will and the human race in general. While you can return the favor and conduct the interrogation with a hands-on approach, a softer style will allow you to learn more about outsider culture and their plans, all while slowly winning over your erstwhile foe. Regardless of if you play good cop or bad cop though, he'll let slip that in order for XCOM's saucer to get to Mosaic and its mysterious controller, Origin, we'll need a phase plot, a MacGuffin that can recalibrate quantum structures and allow us through what Weir calls Venn gates. Naturally, such a device can only be acquired from one of the Outsider's own ships, which means sneaking into one of their main transit hubs here on Earth to try to grab one without being vaporized in the process. But pausing for a moment, as I alluded to, that conversation with the Outsider isn't just pure plot progression with a little bit of brusque FBI flavor. It's also an insight into how the enemy thinks, and a surprisingly subtle one at that. In fact, the level of nuance on display overall with this game is far greater than I expected going back into it, and that really shines in a lot of the character writing. While the general name cast you're dealing with here is quite small, they do a lot to try to give people some real texture to their personalities, and to do so in a way that feels natural, without simply falling into tropes and stereotypes, even when you would expect them to do so. Great examples of this are both Agent Weaver and Dr. Dresner, characters that could easily come off as extremely one-note and thinly written, but instead are given more depth. In the case of Angela, it's the 1960s. And she's a lone, strong woman in the man's world that is government service. And just saying that, I can already feel my eyes rolling into the back of my skull. But, while that is brought up and is absolutely a facet of her experience, it's not the focus of her character in any way. She's not here with some sort of feminist grudge to prove a point that women can fight and die in existential global crises just as good as any man. Rather, she's motivated by actually relevant story reasons that will come into play later. She also doesn't ham-fistedly play a foil to Carter, romantic or otherwise, with their relationship instead being that of colleagues and friends with a slow building trust. They're not rivals, they're not lovers, they're not adversaries, they're professionals, both looking to do what's right and save the world, and that is extremely refreshing in its reality. As for Dr. Dresner, well, Nazi scientist, reformed or otherwise, is a very well-worn archetype you would use in this sort of setting, and it can get tired pretty fast. Despite the Bond villain accent, though, Dresner instead acts in a very human fashion that tracks with how you might expect, or at least hope, an actual paperclip refugee would act. He's not a comically sociopathic intellectual obsessed with science at all costs with no remorse for what happened under his birth country's auspice, nor is he dramatically over-apologetic, rending cloth and pledging service to XCOM to atone for horrendous past crimes. Instead, and it's a bit cliche in a real sense, he was simply following orders, and as a scientist not directly involved with the horrors of the Holocaust or fully informed of their scope, he was able to turn a blind eye when it was happening. Accordingly, he doesn't take personal responsibility for those events, but he does feel remorse for being part of the machine that made it happen, tempered with a need to move forward and further human knowledge, with that overall guilt playing a role in how he conducts his research, which you see during the later stages of the game. Both Dresner and Weaver are handled extremely tastefully, and again, with nuance, not shying away from the reality of what these people in this setting would be, but also not defining them by those tropes and making them actual characters instead of just caricatures. While these are the sterling examples in the bunch, even the smaller side characters get some banter here and there that make them more than just NPCs. Bit characters like Comms Officer Chelsky and Field Agent Percy inject some personality into their dialogues, and those are personalities that are then fleshed out with further backstory and lore notes that makes them feel like more than just office furniture. Hell, even your procedurally generated squad mates, literal random jumbles of assets, are given enough to work with to grow on you and build some small sense of camaraderie. Throughout your missions, they'll occasionally pipe up with observations about what's going on, and that small effort, along with things like the animation I mentioned earlier, go a long way to make them somewhat endearing. Even more so is how Will interacts with them directly, as there's a very specific World War II squad commander dynamic going on here that I really like.
You fellas bring your swim trunks?
What? You afraid of a little water?
No, I'm afraid of what might be in the water.
Oh yeah.
He doesn't conduct his team with the sort of harsh military protocol or rough mercenary company demeanor that you would typically see in shooters at this time. Instead, it's more of a level but hard-headed, boots-on-the-ground approach that feels very classic, with everyone being playfully confident and earnest, but still serious. Appropriately, what I would actually relate it to is how the performances and writing often were in old 50s and 60s B-movies, specifically thinking of stuff like The Thing from Another World. In those old movies, main characters were typically written as reasonable to a fault, not flying off the handle or getting super emotional, instead calmly talking through things like adults. While that can be seen as boring, and does often lead to extended scenes of talking and flat shots of people looking seriously at each other or at documents on a table, there is something to that more sober style of storytelling in opposition to the modern love of heightened emotion or the Marvel urge to try to shove a one-liner in whenever things get quiet. But at this point, I'm risking heading off on a nightmarishly long tangent comparing modern writing to old writing, and we've barely started this war we're in with ET, so let's stop here and go find that phase plotter. Returning to Falk, he says that after discussing the results of the interrogation with Dr. Weir, they've identified an outsider docking tower in New Mexico that would be an ideal target for us to go loop that bit of plot progression. Even better, our buddy De Silva is already in the area, investigating some suspicious nearby sleepwalker activity. But worryingly, he and his team have gone dark after attempting to reach the tower themselves. With their last report being a few days ago now, Carter is given the job of heading in to link up with them to figure out what's going on, as well as to escort Weir to the tower so that they can boost themselves a piece of intergalactic MacGuffinry. Flying into the quiet desert town, we can see sleepwalkers wandering the streets below, lost in their last moments of volition and showing just how desolate this formerly pleasant suburban landscape has truly become. Not knowing where to start to find De Silva, Carter and his crew hit Main Street and disembark from the chopper, while Weir stays in the Bird to lend support over the radio, acting as a lone voice in your ear against the oppressive, atmospheric quiet of the dusky southwestern streets. Well, the streets aren't wholly quiet. Just as they did at the start of the game, the Bureau croons out some licensed music here, with Connie Francis asking you, "Who's sorry now?" the tune echoing out between abandoned cars against the haunting silence. It hits hard with lyrics not meant for the situation, but ironically apt, and all with the slightly distorted warble of a record player left to its own devices, hooked up to a dusty speaker no one is listening to. While using licensed music in this way is hardly original, Fallout had been using this same oral flourish for ages well before the Bureau, it is very effective at creating a mood, and they use that to its utmost, employing an eclectic mix of era-appropriate tracks to punctuate quiet moments and let the dread of the situation sink in. It's all big names, too, putting that 2K budget to good use, with classics like Hank Williams' I'll Never Get Out of This World Alive, and Patsy Cline's Walking After Midnight being recognizable even to those who don't spend their days listening to 75-year-old albums like I do. That said, it's not just for name recognition that these songs and other notable 50s classics were used. Rather, each fits the moment in specifically appropriate ways. Put simply, it feels like the story and mood they wanted to create drove the choice of which songs they licensed, rather than them simply being a novelty. And of course, once you turn off the radio, there's a really strong orchestral soundtrack at work here as well, courtesy of renowned gaming composer Gary Scheinman, who also did the scores for all the BioShock games. Leaning a bit more 60s and 50s, his OST goes hard with a lot of the instrumentation and motifs we'd get from espionage and war dramas of the time. He brings in these crashes of heavy brass and percussion with a driving, serious tone, all set to a backbone of harsh violin, manic piano, and even some playfully schlocky action bongos, all evoking a sense of hard-nosed Cold War conflict. Mixed in with that, we naturally get some good, spooky tonal music as well, employing what sounds like glass harmonica and synth to give that otherworldly edge and a sense of the unknown. Those tracks are a hint towards the alien nature of our foe, but, and this is really my only complaint with the music here, I don't feel like they go far enough. If you're going to make your mid-century alien invasion game, and plan a bunch of B-movie tropes like this, then where in the fuck is your theremin? Maybe it's in there and just very subtly mixed, but it really does feel like a missed opportunity not to put it to more overt, distinct use, and create moments where we take in the grand, unknowable horror of what's going on, while electric angels scream to the heavens. Can sci-fi theremin be a bit campy? Sure. Is it cliche? Absolutely. But it works. It worked in the cinema back in the days of William Castle, and it's a cultural stamp that, when used right, works just as well now, and acts as musical shorthand to get your audience in the right mindset to look at the stars and wonder if we are truly alone. But of course, music isn't everything, and in a game with this much talking in it, VO is also pretty damn important, and thankfully, they do a decent job with it overall. Smartly avoiding any big Hollywood names or stunt casting as you often saw at the time, the credits are instead stacked top to bottom with veteran working voice actors, with dozens upon dozens of credits, each spanning various major gaming franchises and cartoons and anime. Basically, if you need one person to sound like 10 and for them all to sound distinct but still convincing, these are the people you'd call. And given all this room to work, along with decently written characters to voice, as we've already covered, they collectively deliver a very consistently high level of vocal performance that does a good job of selling these characters. That being said, their VO is a bit let down by the mixing of it all, which is one of the places in this game where the duct tape starts to show again.
Carter, good work in there. I'm honestly surprised you kept your cool.
That wasn't my first interrogation.
It shows. Having a defector on our side could make a big difference.
And who knows? Someday, they might be great allies.
Let's just focus on making it through this war.
Specifically, a lot of the takes used are cut a bit too tight, presumably with the idea of avoiding awkward pauses, but instead it means people's lines start to run into one another. It ends up creating that distinctly uncanny sense where you can very clearly hear that the two people you're watching have a conversation recorded their respective halves of it completely separate from one another, with no direct interaction. That's not completely out of the norm, of course, for voice acting. You generally don't record both sides of a conversation at the same time anyways, so that reality is not a fault in and of itself. That said, it's generally something that's carefully hidden to preserve immersion. That's hard to do, though, when a script is in flux, as we know this game's was, distorting the reference an actor might be using, and that's further exacerbated when time constraints might not allow for retakes or potentially for more thorough editing passes. Again, it's not the end of the world, and we've certainly seen worse on this very channel, but it is noticeable, and it does detract at times from the gravitas the actors and the story are trying to convey. While I'm waxing lyrical about the audio in this game, we might as well cover the Foley as well. And just like the VO, that final piece of the puzzle is something this game does well, with some rough edges. In a broad sense, it's fantastic, especially when it comes to atmospheric noise. The bass in particular is a great example of this, always quiet but alive with the thrum of supercomputers, the quiet private murmur of staff, clattering drawers and shuffling papers, perfectly bringing forth that quiet tension of heads down work to save the world. All throughout this game, you can tell that they clearly put a lot of work into the subtle details of the soundscape, and it really does give the levels some character, while helping hide away the fact that in terms of design, they are all pretty much just hallways with arenas interspersed across them. Where the sound effects falter, though, is on the more direct side of things. Some are decent, with the gun reports in general being solid, the 1911 being a standout. I'm pretty sure there was a FUD on the team, as reloading Browning's gift to boomers comes with that perfect subtle scrape of the slide as it's being racked. But other things that should have a good, pronounced sound aren't done quite so well, with a lot of the alien weaponry sounding weak, and punches especially, well, lacking punch. Like with the VO though, and in combination with the larger soundscape, the sound effects overall are good enough. But that inconsistency does stick out a bit, and takes the edge off some moments that really needed that extra kick. To change the station though, and get back to the empty streets of Pima, Weir eventually reports that he's caught De Silva broadcasting on the AM band, and Carter rushes over to the local radio station to rendezvous with him. When they arrive, though, they find the place under outsider assault, clearly not the first that De Silva has repelled, as the place is littered with explosive charges that he's previously set up. Helping him break the siege, Carter quickly meets up with Nico at the front door, only to see that he's deep in the throes of the sleepwalker infection himself, and desperately trying to fight it off. Before Will can ask more about it, though, the station falls under greater attack, and he and his crew step in to help with the defense, as De Silva lends support by setting off those charges he's planted all around. Once the assault lifts, Carter and his boys go inside and finally get a chance to talk with Nico, and the news isn't good. While he and his team did make it to the tower, they tripped an alarm of some sort along the way, and his crew was cut down before he knew it. He's been on the run ever since, hiding in the shadows and evading outsider patrols for days now, all while the sleepwalker infection was setting in deeper and deeper. He knows he's done for at this point, barely holding it together, but he is able to let us know about a secret entrance into the tower in the warehouse of a nearby supermarket. Before he completely loses it to the dread alien flu, though, he wants to give Carter a proper hand, using the last of his fortitude and his C4 to go on a suicide mission to distract the outsiders from the supermarket and thin their numbers. It's a noble sacrifice, but unnecessary, and you can instead convince him to simply set up his distraction and then get out of Dodge, allowing himself to be taken back to base so that the eggheads there can try to cure him. And I like De Silva, so that's what I did. But I do like that there's some variance here and an attempt to make your dialogue wheel feel like it's actually worth a damn. Either way, as you head onwards via the nearby foothills, you'll see Nico fire off his diversion, setting a car slamming into a gas station and blowing the place to Kingdom Come, presumably attracting every sectoid in a 70-mile radius. This gives us a clear path to the supermarket, and once you empty out the parking lot of a few late-night shoppers, Weir joins us as well, and the group heads off to the tower. He's here to help us hack Mosaic systems, and to get us in and around without activating the same alarms that De Silva's boys did, whose corpses we find along the way, a reminder of the dangers ahead. Once inside, we get an idea of exactly why the outsiders have been infecting the populace, as we see sleepwalkers being packaged up and stuffed into transport ships, presumably sent off to the alien homeworld, though to what end is worryingly unsure. There's no time to dwell on it though, as this game doesn't have a stealth system, so our trek up the tower isn't gonna be a quiet one. That's not necessarily a bad thing though, as at this point the combat is really starting to open up and become genuinely fun. That's because by now, you and your squaddies will have unlocked a few of the more interesting abilities, as well as some backpacks and fancier weapons, all the core components you need to start actually varying up your play. Now don't get too excited, this ain't Diablo and build crafting isn't exactly a core part of the experience, but you do get a decent amount of ways to play around between those three pillars in surprisingly subtle ways. Starting with the abilities, each of the classes has multiple ones that they can spec into, all with different purposes, generally splitting the difference between buffing, crowd control, distraction, and sheer DPS. Depending on the role you want them to serve, you can have medics that focus on shielding or buffing, commandos that are more about dishing out damage or drawing attention, recon units that either sneak behind enemy lines or force enemies to shift their focus in a different direction, engineers spec'd into demolitions or into defense. It's all about building a unit that fits into a niche, one that can control the battlefield in different ways. That is then further complemented by those backpacks I've alluded to before, the only real piece of side gear that you get to equip, all of which offer passive buffs of varying usefulness and complexity. Some are flat bonuses affecting defense or ability cooldowns, and some are more situational, doing things like increasing headshot damage or making it quicker to revive allies. Nothing they offer is all that impressive, and frankly I wish they did more with this feature, but they do enough to add some nuance to how your boys can operate, and with the perks and abilities you earn, there are some really strong synergies that you can employ. And then lastly, you have the weapons, and sadly this is likely the least developed part of how you're building your characters. But the arsenal that is here works and does offer a few interesting wrinkles. Guns overall generally break down into pistols, shotguns, assault weapons, and sniper rifles, with a ballistic option on offer for each and then 2 to 3 alien ones per category. There are some outliers like the burst fire missile launcher and the Diet BFG you don't get until the last level, but those are only to be used by Carter and are clearly not meant to be main weapons just due to ammo limitations. For the most part, you'll be using guns from one of those previously aforementioned categories, and so will your squad, with each class focusing on a specific weapon type. As such, for your boys, there isn't really a ton of choice there, as you'll generally just kit them out with whatever the most recently acquired ray gun is for their class. For Carter at least though, you're spoiled for choice, and the 2 weapons you choose for him will then help inform which squad mates you should bring along to balance out your options, further giving some nuance to how you build your team. Sticking with the weapons for a bit though, something I do appreciate is that it's not a purely linear progression of arms, and they do balance things out in such a way that even the starting 1911 is useful the whole game through. Some of that comes from just sheer damage. Browning's favorite son has won 2 world wars after all, and the devs clearly wanted to put a third under its belt, as its DPS remains solid the whole game through. Same goes for the rest of the bullet-fed options, and even into the end of the game they can hold their own, though the alien guns generally end up with a slight edge in those final fights due to ammo availability. And that is the other interesting quirk in how weapons work here. Alien guns use energy and human guns use bullets, and how available that ammo is depends on the situation. What this means in practice is that as you start a level, often on the far outskirts of some alien installation as we did here in Pima, you're going to run into mostly ballistic ammo and weapons lying around. And then as you get farther along, encountering more and more outsider infrastructure, that's when energy packs start showing up. This means you have choices to make, both before the mission and setting up your loadout, and on the fly as you pick up guns in the field, as to what arms you should carry based on what you can actually find ammunition for. It's a very simple dynamic, but one that adds another layer of in-the-field strategic consideration that can add some nice tension, especially as the amount of overall ammunition you can carry at any given time is relatively limited. The only thing that I think lets it down is that the ballistic options are as scant as they are, encouraging you to ditch lead for photons pretty quickly, as that's what the enemy is dropping and what you know you'll be finding on sight in later arenas. It's a pity too, because in the Cold War era that this is set in, there are all sorts of really dumb, weird prototype things that they could pull from that would make the category of human-made arms a bit more varied and worth holding on to. I mean, hell, give me some of that Project Salvo shit and let me tear up a sectoid with explosive tipped flechettes. Or give me an M79 loaded with the strongest stuff you can put into a 40mm shell. We're not exactly beholden to po-faced reality here. Case in point, this giant combine-ass tower we've been climbing, near the summit of which Will finally finds that transponder. As soon as he grabs it though, alarms sound, and Weir chimes up from his post at the Mosaic station down below to tell us that all of the teleporters heading back down have been disabled. It's at this point that the outsider commander leading this invasion, Axis, booms out over the PA and calls Carter outside to the roof. On the way up, as we push through more grunts, Axis keeps up the conversation, trying to convince Carter that they're not our enemies and that there's a place for mankind within their empire, though the destruction they've already wrought says otherwise. After making clear he's going to remain a thorn in their side, once Carter arrives on the roof, Axis sicks a giant shifting toroidal construct at him and his crew, one that fires off massive MVC laser beams at us. It's a remnant, or at least a callback, to some of the promotional material for the original version of this game, though scaled up a bit, which somehow makes it less intimidating. It's very clearly just here for show though, a set piece to be referenced during reviews and used for screenshots, let down by having this fight take place in a boring barren arena, and by having it do nothing more mechanically than just take potshots at us. It'll still happily kill you, mind, if you don't keep moving, but for a game all about on-the-move tactical nuance, There isn't any here. You just duck behind cover until it's safe, pop off a few rounds, and then head to the next piece of cover. Before too long, you'll have taken it down, allowing Barnes and Weir to come evac us off the top of the tower and get back to base with the transponder in tow. Arriving back at base, Carter and his team are met at gunpoint by Falk. He informs them that the science team have put together a test that will allow XCOM to suss out any further saboteurs. Everyone going in or out of the base needs to pass, and as such, Will and the crew are taken to a quarantine chamber so they can be cleared. As for how the test works, it seems that Dresner has managed to isolate and recreate one of Mosaic's auditory commands. For regular humans, it's just noise, but for any hidden outsiders or nascent sleepwalkers, it will force them to react violently and lash out. Shockingly, Carter reacts to the signal, but not in either of the expected ways, instead reeling in pain and loudly exclaiming that he is William Carter before passing out. After waking up in the medbay and finding himself surprisingly not in custody, Carter goes to debrief with Falk and walks in on him having an argument with Agent Weaver. It seems she's tracked Axis down to somewhere in Oregon and wants to go hunt him down immediately, but Falk is ordering her to stand down, implying that she's too personally involved to take the lead on this. Instead, he orders her and Will to work together to narrow down his location to something more reasonable than an entire state. Talking to Angela afterwards, she's clearly on edge and a bit out of sorts about the whole situation, but still focused on the work, and as such she lays out where she's at so far. Going off some odd radio signals that started cropping up, she's managed to pin Axis down to the southwest part of the state, but can't get an exact fix on him. As neither her nor Carter are necessarily technically adept, the two decide to split up and seek help from some of the better versed staff on base. For his part, Will goes and talks to Comms Officer Chulsky, who sets to work refining the signals down and triangulating the location. He also checks in with Dr. Weir, who, knowing the ins and outs of Mosaic, offers up the key insight that we should take Axis alive, as the implant in his head, the one with all the juicy access to Mosaic, will be wiped upon his death. What with Axis leading the invasion here on Earth, that intel could prove vital to the war effort and the larger plan to strike Mosaic and Origin directly. Carter is then called up to chat with Falk afterward, and the boss makes dead clear that he does not want Angela on this mission, as he needs someone with a clear head who can take Axis in alive. Weaver is too close to the situation, and he's worried that she'll gun him down without considering the consequences. While Will makes the case that she should be brought along regardless due to the work she's put in on this, his argument quickly becomes moot, as an announcement rings out saying that a Sky Ranger has launched unauthorized. With it being clear that Agent Weaver has gone rogue, Carter's mission changes from just capturing Axis to also stopping Angela, peacefully if at all possible. Before heading out though, you can do some optional snooping as well, to try and figure out Weaver's motives and just what makes this case so personal, and the answer is naturally family. It seems that her younger brother, who she was always very protective of, went missing a couple of years back, and through her investigations, she discovered that he was taken during the first subtle waves of the invasion, when the outsiders were quietly laying the seeds of their plan. She's been tirelessly on the hunt for him ever since, looking for any scrap of info she could find on the invaders, which eventually led her to join up with Falk, who'd been quietly raising a stink of his own in DC about the alien menace he suspected was coming. If this all sounds kind of familiar, well, that's because she's essentially just a gender-bent version of Fox Mulder.
They have women agents?
More or less.
Weaver wants to do a hell of a lot more than just believe, though, so we chase after her to Oregon, finding the remains of her campfire and luckily managing to get a hold of her on comms. She's way ahead of Carter and his boys, and while she's not antagonistic to Will or XCOM, she won't commit to not killing Axis before they get what they need out of him. And it's not hard to see why she has such little patience at this point, as the squad continues on and finds that the outsiders have turned this little slice of quiet woodland into a mass grave, dumping dead sleepwalkers into shallow ponds to rot. As they get closer to the outsider base hiding here, they realize that in addition to the cruel culling of the local populace, the aliens have also drained the nearby lake, taking all of the water for reasons that aren't explicitly mentioned. There's no time to ponder it though, as Weaver is just ahead and now wants to meet up with Carter, seemingly coming around to the idea of working with him. Getting into the base, we quickly find out why. She's found her brother, Pete, and he's been trapped here for a very long time, being used for something truly awful. As one of the earliest captives, he wasn't just made a sleepwalker slave, but rather was used as a test subject to develop the infection in the first place, and is now painfully kept alive as an incubation tank for the virus. Angela wants to save him and bring him back home if she can, but she needs your help to do it. Working together, Angela hangs back at the entrance, monitoring the base's systems and providing support, while Will and his team carve a path forward, getting a good look at the alien black site. And unsurprisingly, it looks a lot like every other bit of outsider infrastructure we've seen so far, all stark metal corridors with random blue glowy bits, putting it very much in line with some of the 7th gen's uglier design standards. While I think the visual sameness of this era often gets overblown, the predilection for gunmetal corridors back then will always annoy me, as they're just not interesting to look at, and they really were everywhere, appearing multiple times on this channel already. Sadly, the more the Bureau goes on, the more steel outsider shame hallways we'll have to walk through, and this level is really where the balance shifts more in that direction, and away from the fun Americana set-piece locales. Speaking of 7th gen design tropes, this game also borrows heavily from the UI style that BioShock pioneered 6 years earlier, using slideshows and electromechanical dings and whirs to signify a world before the microchip. It does get something of a pass here, simply because of the developer. I'm sure 2K Marin built up a lot of that style in their asset library working on BioShock 2 after all, but it does stand out as feeling tonally off from the more grounded tone of the rest of the game. Not too grounded, thankfully, as they did manage to avoid the other 7th gen cliche of having a color palette akin to a Starbucks bean chart. Instead, they employed that saturation slider a touch more liberally, and allowed some areas and assets to pop a bit more, often smartly using a lot of diegetic colored lighting. Admittedly, the Bureau is still somewhat on the muted side overall, but I duly applaud its baby steps towards the 8th gen, where we started removing the shit and piss filter from every game that got rated M. Of course, there are some visual flaws here that simply can't be waved away as trends of a bygone age. As you might have guessed based on its history, there's devils in the finer details with this game that never got exercised. A great example of this is the way that Carter will regularly cross his arms in conversation. It's a motion clearly intended to convey a sense of stern tension, and it does, but that tension is then undercut by his omnipresent holster clipping into his arm every time he does it. This could have easily been worked around by adjusting the pose or simply removing the holster, but I bet the model and animation were made years apart from each other, and the conflict was just something that was never noticed, at least not until it was too far down the priority list to bother fixing. Something else minor you might see in these conversations is that the mouth animations look a little disturbingly uncanny. They're not done poorly exactly, but rather they feel over-animated. Like every character is fully enunciating every syllable of every word. But then the VO obviously doesn't reflect that because it was actually done well. Once you get used to those off-putting mouth flaps though, you don't even notice the uncanniness. But it is another one of those areas where just a tad more polish would have gone a long way. Perhaps that's why so much of the dialogue in mission is delivered over radios and PA systems, rather than trying to do codec-style talking heads. That especially goes for the enemy leaders like Axis, as they're clearly not fun to animate talking, so instead he talks to you exclusively over intercom as you're crawling through his hideout looking for Angela's brother Pete. Despite his failure in New Mexico, he's still trying to convince Carter to work with the outsiders at this point, calling Will the prisoner and claiming that Origin can free him and help harness his powers. And as you can imagine, Weaver is having none of that, with Axis's comments only further emboldening her drive for revenge. A pain that is then catalyzed when you find her brother and it's clear that he is in no condition to be rescued. He's nothing more than a husk at this point, after years of being twisted to alien ends, and there's no way he could be safely removed from the bramble of machinery he's been made part of, a system slowly sucking away at his tainted insides. Angela grasps the reality of the situation just as clearly as Will does, and accordingly asks for a moment of privacy so she can say goodbye and help her brother one last time. With Peter now at peace, Angela joins in the fighting, picking off foes from the rafters as Carter and the squad push forward to Axis. After a few more fights and further evidence of the vile things they're doing to their captives here, we eventually find our quarry, and without even a word descend into a boss fight. As with the donut from earlier, it's a pretty typical affair, with him chucking up a big shield that needs to be disabled by shutting down 3 different generators, all while waves of enemy troops make their assault. It's cliché to be sure, but it's at least well paced, and the sheer number of enemies, along with getting to make clever use of Angie's sniping, helps keep things interesting, and makes it more engaging than the other big mission-ending fights we've had so far. Eventually, once you take Axis's slippery teleporting ass down after removing his shield, Angela confronts the invasion spearhead, but manages to stay her hand. And then, despite explicitly being told to keep Axis alive, Will says to Angela that they've gotten everything they need, and lets her execute him anyways. Now, to be clear, we've in no way gotten everything we need. Weir was pretty damn insistent that we had to bring Axis in alive to get at his juicy brain meat and the implant therein. But the mission end screen claims that we've successfully apprehended and debriefed him, so we're good to let Lady Rambo turn his frontal lobe into jelly salad, I guess. It's a really weird turn in this narrative, and absolutely deflates the whole arc of this chapter, and Angela's character, but someone thought a little vengeance was more satisfying than following through on all those threads of logic they set up for needing to keep Axis alive, so fuck it. We start in on this next chapter talking with Falk, who is also somehow absolutely fine with us letting Weaver take Axis out gangland style, despite the fact the whole reason he didn't want to let her go in the first place was to prevent that from happening. We're all just moving on from this plot hole apparently though, and he's calling our insubordination a blessing in disguise, as it apparently stopped the outsiders from mass contaminating the nation's water supply with, the stuff. That said, some still got out there, and tens of thousands of people were exposed, so we need to put a button in this alien shit quick before the infection can be allowed to progress, and even more of our populace sleepily wanders into the outsiders' arms. Talking to Angela, she's still reeling from everything she dealt with on our last mission, but as a company woman to the end, she's keeping her head on straight as there's a bigger fight coming. That's because going over the intel we recovered from the last mission, it becomes clear that the invasion thus far has been nothing more than a landing raid, the outsiders establishing their beachhead before the main force arrives. Current projections show Origin's larger army potentially arriving in a matter of hours, a day at most, meaning this is our one and only chance to stop them. That means we need to get the Bureau's flying saucer, the Avenger, up in the air, and warp to the outsider homeworld to end all of this before it can go any further. After checking in with Weir, who confirms he's gotten Mosaic's coordinates from the data we recovered, I guess Axis had that written on a note stuck to his monitor or something, we meet back up with Falk so we can all board the Avenger and set off. It's not going to be a direct shot though, as we need to make a layover at an outsider dimensional gate to actually make our way through one of their wormholes. Thankfully, we know of one hidden behind a dam in Arizona, so we can make our way over there to liberate it and use it to slink across the galaxy. As we prepare to leave, though, Falk comes on board and reveals his ace in the hole, a massive Illyrium nuke, further raising the stakes on this already assumed suicide mission. And with that, the highly classified airship that's been built up all game as a pinnacle of space-age aeronautic tech limply takes off without a sound, quickly arriving at the dam and dropping Carter and his squad off so they can take it back from the alien menace. By the time you get to this push through the dam, the gameplay of the Bureau has fully developed, especially if you've been dutifully completing all the minor ops. If so, by now you'll have gotten more or less all of the different weapons on offer, have a crew of fully leveled agents, and likely will have unlocked all of Carter's main abilities, meaning the game can truly take the gloves off and really start to test your skills. In fact, while I would say that the first half of this game leans on spectacle to engage the player, giving you visual set pieces and a heavy sense of atmosphere to enjoy, that shifts from this point onwards, with the well-honed combat becoming the new focus. While the levels themselves start to get less interesting visually, you're gonna see a whole lot more of those metal corridors I hate, the actual composition and pacing of the fights you'll be put into ramps up significantly. You'll start facing greater numbers and with more heavy units that do unique things mixed in, really testing your ability to prioritize targets and cleverly use Carter and his squad's abilities to control the battlefield. Just as Will is written and acted with that World War II squad leader tone, that vibe is also reflected in the gameplay once it's fully evolved. At its zenith, the Bureau's combat is never about concocting some grand strategic plan or some sort of DPS power fantasy. Rather, it's about tensely trying to hold ground and maintain your squad's footing in the fight, smartly adapting against a foe who's fighting just as hard as you are and who ostensibly has the advantage. It's small-scale squad warfare, where overbearing enemy aggression and your own limited resources force you to meet the challenge head-on and push up over the hill, using quick thinking and skill to get into more advantageous positions, survive, and turn the tide. That's the design philosophy here, and on veteran difficulty at least, it delivers, with the Outsiders being vicious in their attacks and the looming threat of permadeath for squaddies adding a distinct sense of danger. Admittedly, that danger is more theoretical than a constant worry though, as the game isn't that difficult. I only ended up ever fully losing a couple of agents in the field, as the revival system is pretty generous, giving you lots of time to pick up fallen comrades, though the timer does diminish with each time they hit the ground in a fight. Still, it's enough to provide the proceedings with some of that fuck you energy I expect from XCOM, and make the situation just that much more dire. Not that a suicide mission to save the globe isn't pressing enough on its own, but a little personal investment in your crew helps make it easier to give a damn moment to moment. Speaking of dams, it seems that the Outsiders have done some major remodeling with this one, as once you get past the upper floors, you find a whole base hiding underwater at the bottom of the reservoir. As you enter these areas, Origin starts talking to Carter telepathically, claiming he's been searching for Will for a long time and doesn't wish to harm him, though the sectoids you can see penned up as Origin speaks imply a darker fate for those who side with the Outsider Empire. Getting past that bit of psionic begging, you then find yourself completely under the lake and at the Ven Gate, with the Avengers slipping in to meet up with the squad. Passing through one last hurdle, a quick combat arena to force the gate back open and clear a path forward, Carter and his crew board the saucer and fly off to the alien homeworld. Exiting the wormhole, the crew then surveys the expanse of jagged metal architecture and swirling poisonous clouds from which the Outsider Empire spawned. It's a world kept under Origin's thumb, though the Avengers' cloaking tech thankfully keeps them hidden from his panoptic gaze, and they're able to fly to his hidden base, locking onto it with a beacon I presume they derived from yet more sticky notes left on Axis's desktop. It's at this point that the team splits up, with Weaver and the rest of the Avenger crew heading over to the Mosaic Core to set up the nuke, while Carter and his squad go to confront Origin directly. As with Axis, Weir cautions that we must try to capture Origin and take him in alive. But at this point, he most certainly knows we're coming, so that'll be easier said than done. Not that it'll be a complicated task to reach Origin, though, as the path to his throne room consists of basically just an extended train ride that acts as one long arena fight, with waves of enemies crashing against you, while Origin vaguely rambles in order to foreshadow the upcoming big twist. And with that, I will put up a rare spoiler warning, because while I don't think the plot in this game overall is amazingly well written, the turn of events that's about to transpire is certainly one of the more interesting facets of the game, and worth seeing for yourself if you plan to play through it. If you don't want the big twist spoiled, hop ahead to the Hangar 6 chapter of this video, where I talk about the DLC for this game before wrapping everything up. With that warning out of the way, let's cut to Origin's throne room, where he and Carter finally get to talk face to face. Following up on his ranting from earlier, Origin claims that a demon is controlling Carter, one that has been secretly hiding away on Earth for millennia, planning to eventually reveal itself. The arrival of the Outsiders at Groom Range simply accelerated its plan, making it choose Carter as a host. And then, with an excruciatingly painful jolt of electricity, Origin proves this by forcing out of Will a floating, tentacled humanoid shape, appearing behind him, connected to him. Origin says that he was once the same as Carter, a thrall to such a demon, and the camera pans up to show us a similar creature to Will's, captured in some sort of energy matrix. This being was the furnace with which the Outsider Empire was forged, one forcibly divorced from Origin and bent to his whim. His exposition dump over, but with no budget left for a proper boss fight, Origin then lifts Carter into the air and somehow blows him up to the platform where the alien creature, called an ethereal, is being held. Seeing this as the perfect opportunity to cripple the enemy, Will uses the Ven Brace to capture the ethereal and steal it away from the Outsiders. At this point, Falk and Weir show up out of literally fucking nowhere to escort Carter back to the Avenger, while the ethereal burns away in his brace, Dresner's genius bit of tech only barely managing to contain it. They then fly off back to Arizona as the Illyrium nuke Weaver set up at the Mosaic core explodes, doing some amount of damage, presumably. They don't really linger on it long enough to get a sense of what actually happens, and making a very disappointingly small amount of noise for a super bomb powered by a rare magic element from the stars. With our mission complete and the outsider invasion halted, we cut back to the Bureau's ops room, where Falk is giving a speech to the assembled staff. While Origin may be dead, the war isn't over, and there's a lot of cleanup left to do with alien forces stranded here on Earth that still need to be dealt with. While the speech goes on, we intercut to Weaver and Weir helping Carter to the lab, so that the captured ethereal can be transferred to the big Illyrium tank that's been ominously sitting there all game. This tank is the only facility we have that's even theoretically capable of holding it, as the ethereal is a being composed entirely of energy, a near limitless amount, and now we need to figure out what to do with it. Despite the strain of bringing back the ethereal, though, Carter is still needed in the field, so after dropping it off, he heads back to Ops to talk with Falk. Eavesdropping on various conversations along the way, and talking with the big man himself, the current tenor of the situation becomes clear. With Origin dead and Mosaic destroyed, the Vengates are now closed, and the remaining outsiders are in disarray. Cut off from supply and with no command structure left to guide them, the tide has turned, but that raises new questions of its own. How do we handle these scattered rogue alien guerrilla groups? And moreover, what do we do with the ones who want to defect, or surrender? Humanity won't be so quick to forgive the wholesale destruction and wanton mass murder the outsiders committed after all. They're more likely to demand revenge rather than happily taking them in as refugees, but that can't then justify a genocide and retaliation, can it? Heavy questions, to be sure, and like with the character writing I mentioned earlier, it's handled thoughtfully, at least in this moment, as you hear a number of different perspectives from people around the base on the situation. Regardless of the larger matters at hand, though, there are still immediate problems on the ground that need to be taken care of, specifically an outsider comms hub that's popped up in Illinois, which Falk sends you off to shut down. As Carter selects the mission from the board, though, and gets ready to set off, a power surge rocks the base and knocks out the lights. It seems that the ethereal in the lab has woken up, and Carter and Falk head down to meet with it. As Will approaches the tank, the creature swims up to him, staring out from the other side of the glass, and begins to mimic his movements. Or perhaps it's the other way around, as Carter's arms start to glow and the other ethereal we saw connected to him during our confrontation with Origin reappears. In this moment, the two ethereals step out of time to converse as only they can, revealing the truth of our situation. You see, we were never playing as William Carter. Right from the start, we are and have always been the ethereal, who back in Groom Range bonded with Carter to save his life. The ethereals are an advanced but solitary race, singularly seeded to worlds throughout the universe. Once a society becomes sufficiently advanced, the ethereal awakens and finds a host, an exemplar of that planet's people, becoming one with them and providing them with immense power and knowledge in order to help guide and uplift their host civilization as a whole. For us, though, this process was unduly kickstarted by the Outsiders' invasion, forcing us to wake up too early before we had fully developed, and causing us to bond with Carter, who, if you've been paying attention to the various lore notes scattered around, is a tortured individual who may not represent the best of humanity. It's a hell of a twist, and a really interesting idea from a narrative perspective, especially in the meta sense of us, the player, having been controlling Carter this whole time, because this is a video game, and not thinking about any layer in between. That said, while it's a cool, lofty sci-fi concept, and there's plenty of vague foreshadowing to lead into it, the actual build-up and reveal of this twist and execution does feel a bit rushed, and a lot of this lore dumping they're doing here does feel like it could have been delivered more organically. More pressing, though, than all of this nonsense about us being some sort of secular alien instant messiah, the other ethereal lets us know that Origin is apparently still alive and coming for us. In a bid to stop him and prevent Mosaic from spreading any further, the other ethereal wants to enact a cleansing of both worlds, simultaneously wiping out the Outsiders and humanity. We refuse, naturally, and the other ethereal backs down from their plan with surprisingly little resistance, and agrees to consider other options. But as they do, both ethereals are yanked back to reality. It seems that Carter has no plans on being anyone's vessel and breaks away from us. He then uses his newfound freedom in exactly the sort of stupidly destructive way that all of those lore notes suggested he would, by pulling out his sidearm and firing on the tank. Despite not having a corporeal form, and therefore theoretically being unaffected by solid matter, 45 caliber just don't give a shit apparently, and Carter manages to shoot the being of immense, unknowable power dead with just a bit of hot lead. This causes it to explode, knocking us and Carter unconscious, and we then cut to a flashback of Carter in an interrogation chair, something we've been seeing throughout the whole game. But instead of him responding to unseen interlocutors, he's talking to us directly. He makes it very clear that he is not happy about having been made our meat puppet, and to him, we're an alien threat the same as Origin, and he's going to rip us out and destroy us. It's a strong few moments, with the game once again leaning on its really strong character writing to have us focus on this new dynamic we exist in. Which is good, because otherwise, we might look at the plot and see how it is absolutely riddled with holes and spackle. It's not so bad at the start of the game, as the premise here is simple. Alien invasion stories are a dime a dozen after all, and they lay out enough business to cover up for the initial questions. For example, if this is a prequel, why does no one in the later XCOM games seem to reference this massive early invasion? Well, that's because all of the major television and radio broadcasts have been locked down, and the agency is feeding local affiliates convenient cover stories to prevent panic, with the majority of eyewitnesses to these attacks being dead or now sleepwalkers. That admittedly feels a bit hand-wavy, but they do make sure to reinforce and work that context into the main narrative, so the suspension of disbelief is upheld. Same goes for the reason they give for how we can seemingly pull new soldiers out of thin air and staff this whole base despite the invasion being a surprise ambush that took out the entire country. The answer to that is that the Bureau had been in existence for quite some time already, quietly preparing for a Soviet invasion, and as such had already tapped experienced members of the various military and government branches to be ready to serve at a moment's notice. Again, at face value it's a bit weak, but they do enough to reference it with where the specific people you're working with came from and the rush of how all the staff got activated that it covers things up pretty well. Where things start to fall apart is in the back half of the game, where they actually have to try to finish the story and not just deploy twists and fun narrative ideas. That's how you get dropped plot threads, like Weir's sleepwalker turncoat assistant Lawrence, and poorly explained developments, like Origin not being dead somehow and rebuilding Mosaic without his ethereal. Hell, even just simpler quibbles, like how in the fuck Weir, Falk, and Carter managed to escape from Origin's throne room, are big open questions that make no sense. We're supposed to believe that two old men and a basically crippled Carter managed to somehow bypass that fucking train ride we took in, as well as all of the remaining forces in Origin's base, and made it to the Avenger completely unnoticed and unscathed? That feels messy, and the game is asking the player to ignore a lot, just so it can push the story forward. While it's easy to suspend disbelief in the moment, it's the sort of stuff that when you think about it later, you realize it just doesn't quite track. And then, once you start thinking about those smaller holes, bigger ones appear, and you realize that we never really get told basic, key information, like why the Outsiders are even here on Earth in the first place. At various times, the game implies it's for resources, or to escape their dying planet, or to capture slave labor, or to take Carter's ethereal, and all of those are probably true, but it's never really clarified in any way that gives our opposing force a real motivation that we can understand and grapple with. Instead, the Outsiders are reduced to being an ill-defined and nebulous foe. Ironically not alien enough to feel unknowable in a Lovecraftian way, but rather just poorly written and not well fleshed out. You get a little bit of their culture and ideas from your conversations with the detained infiltrator, but it's all very surface level and along very cliched Klingon warrior lines, which doesn't give us anything specific to latch onto or make them feel genuinely believable in any way. That's fine early on while we're just enjoying the alien invasion premise, but This lack of detail means the game has less to work with narratively in its later chapters, and as a result, we end up with them cutting a lot of corners, simply saying things are happening outside of our view, and cutting to when they're already in motion. Case in point, after Carter showed that other ethereal the Lord's caliber and knocked us out, we awakened much later back in control of Carter, and with the agency making poor decisions in our absence. Specifically, in order to try to pin down the revived Origin's location and finish him off before he can mount a counterattack, Falk and Weir have convinced our outsider friend to let them slot his implant back in and reconnect him to Mosaic, which I'll remind you shouldn't exist anymore in the first place. As you can imagine, this plan has some flaws, and as soon as the infiltrator is connected back to the network, Mosaic takes control and sends the location of the XCOM base back to Origin, which he should already know, as he sent this guy here in the first place 15 fucking hours ago. Then, upon seeing Carter, the infiltrator sicks the remainder of the outsider army on the base and fucks off, leading to a chase through the bowels of the complex to hunt him down. It's a quick bit of cat and mouse as we chase him through the facility's hallways, dealing with freed outsider captives along the way, all while Origin, speaking through our former alien friend, taunts Carter, still referring to him as the prisoner. It's clear this is having some effect too, as Carter keeps trying to break away from us and our control. Eventually, though, we corner the infiltrator and take him down, with him regaining control at the very end and telling us how he just wishes to be free. Carter grants him this last wish by ripping out his Mosaic implant and giving him peace in his final moments, before picking up the bomb the infiltrator was carrying and walking off. We then rush to the Avenger, watching the base get torn apart by outsider forces along the way, with escape just about in reach. But Carter has something else in mind. He rips away from us once more, breaking the hold of our spectral tentacles and leading us down a hallway to the Illyrium chamber as we try to regain our connection with him. Once there, he commands us into the tank and makes an ultimatum. Get out of his head, or he blows the whole base to Kingdom Come, killing us all and forfeiting Earth to the outsiders in the process. And you can let him do it. It's technically one of the endings in this game, though obviously it's not quite the best place to leave things, and you don't get any epilogue slides if you choose to throw caution to the wind and call his bluff like this. So what are we to do then? Well, if Carter is unwilling to put us up in his head, we need new lodgings, and there are 3 options on the market. In this moment, you can reach out to either Weaver, Weir, or Falk, subtly asking whoever you choose to be your new host. Your chosen human will then become the new player character for the rest of the game, and will each elicit slightly different endings, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Personally, I chose Falk, as he seemed like the logical choice, being the leader of XCOM and the most emotionally balanced of the options available, compared to the more vengeful Weaver and the naively altruistic Weir. Regardless of who you pick, though, they'll then show up and stop Carter from nuking the place before merging with you. The chapter then ends with a montage showing XCOM operatives trying and failing to defend the base, with Falk giving the order to evacuate, as we retreat to the Avenger and are forced to abandon HQ. Now bonded with Falk and sheltering aboard the Avenger with the remaining survivors, including an in-custody Carter, we listen to Weir lay out the current situation. It seems that after the base was taken over, a massive alien structure appeared in Earth's orbit, and is presumed to be Origin's command vessel and the new central node for Mosaic. As people then start asking questions and plot holes start opening up, Falk chimes in to shut those down, by saying that Origin spoke to us telepathically back at the base. Apparently, Origin needed to get his bants in and decided to conveniently brag to us that he had managed to rebuild Mosaic and construct that new superbase by somehow taking over his old ethereal spot as an infinite energy source, all in the vaguely defined but assuredly short amount of time since our last visit. That means that Origin is now at the center of all of this, and quite literally powering the entire outsider war effort, despite, not being an energy-based godlike interdimensional entity, and rather just some asshole with a vagina for a mouth. It's an extremely thin explanation for why this story is still going, and then they try to excuse it by saying that, he studied the ethereal for years, so he picked up a trick or two, but I don't buy it. While I try to keep suspension of disbelief as much as I can, there are limits. Matter to energy conversion ain't Junior League hockey. The act of taking your dying consciousness and transcending it into a being of pure, raw, incorporeal potential is not a cheeky wrist shot that you can just pick up with enough practice. At the very least, though, they do make clear that Origin's general wattage is below that of the literal god being he replaced. So in order for any of this to work, he apparently actually has to be on that command vessel and can't just beam out orders wirelessly across the galaxy anymore. As such, the plan is simple. Go up there with our newly powered fusion Falk and go kick his ass properly this time. That will allow us to then take over his new Mosaic Core and command the Outsider forces to stand down. With the marching orders in place and some time to rally the troops and shake off the jitters, we fly off to begin our assault on the mother ship. In order to actually get to Origin and the Mosaic Core, though, we'll need to go do some video game shit first, with Falk, Weaver, and Weir all splitting up once they arrive to go simultaneously shut down some generators which are currently locking down access. And of course, any hopes that this plan would go smoothly are quickly tossed out the window, as not long after we arrive, we get a call from Barnes back on the Avenger telling us that Carter has broken out of custody and escaped. Carter then comes on the radio himself and makes it quite clear that he would rather see every outsider, every sleepwalker, and every person touched by the ethereal dead before working with us again. And as such, he's determined to stop our plan, not considering the bigger picture. And then somehow managing to get ahead of us, as soon as Falk gets to his generator, we find Carter there waiting, and he sets off something that stuns Falk and triggers all the station's alarms. Cut to another combat encounter as a fight breaks out on 3 fronts, with outsider forces assaulting all 3 generators. Falk, aided by our control, can handle things well enough of course, but Weaver and Weir aren't so lucky, and we're forced to choose which of them to help. Another decision that can mildly affect the ending slides. Personally, I chose to save Weir, as his expertise in this situation is extremely valuable, and realistically, he never joined XCOM as a soldier. He was essentially drafted, albeit more or less willingly, and brought on as an academic, ostensibly intended as a non-combatant. Weaver, on the other hand, joined of her own accord, and to settle her own affairs, which she's since done. She's an enlisted agent of the Bureau, and as such a soldier. To die fighting is a potential fact of that life, especially on a mission like this, and she would have accepted that. In fact, she says as much when Falk tells her that he's going to save Weir instead. She's not completely left to the wolves though, as Falk insists that Carter is coming to help her, though I don't know where he pulls that from, as last I checked, Will was still vengefully edgelording off in the corner. Naturally, saving Weir involves pushing through yet another nebulous metal combat arena, though that's at least spiced up with liberal application of the game's BFG, the lightning cannon, which you likely have if you were thoroughly checking around the earlier parts of this level. It only holds a couple of shots, but it will chew right through even the biggest grunts that Origin will send your way, and thankfully reloads with the standard energy pickups. While it will make this fight go faster, it's not fast enough though, unfortunately, as after saving Weir, we try to call up Angela and get no response. After a few worrying moments of dead air, Carter picks up the line and says that they need backup, so I guess that he's helping after all. And thankfully, there's a convenient teleporter right there behind Weir's generator waiting to take us to him. Stepping through, we arrive in the middle of an active firefight, with Carter pinned down and massively outgunned, and after helping him take out the enemy forces, we head to the back of the room and unfortunately find Angela dead. Will did what he could to save her, but there were just too many of them. Not wanting to let her sacrifice be in vain, we need to press forward, and thankfully Carter agrees to shut down the generator here in Angela's stead, though he makes sure to keep up his new Shadow the Hedgehog shtick, and lets us know that as soon as the barrier is down, we'll be enemies again. And he actually makes good on that promise, because as soon as we head back and shut down our generator, he bamfs in to try to stop us from going any further. He's put in his place by our crew though, formerly Carter's crew I suppose, and they hold him in custody, giving us one last moral choice to make. While you can try to reason with Will, nothing you say is going to make him see the light, so you're forced to either put him down like a mad dog, or let him live, with Weir saying he'll take Carter back to the ship if you choose the latter. And that's the option I went with, because killing the character you spent most of the game playing as honestly does feel a bit strange. And I always tend to play the Paladin anyways, though logically putting him down probably would have been the smarter plan and potentially kinder too. After all, his family is already dead, his service career is now clearly toast, putting the fate of humanity in jeopardy will do that, and he's gonna spend the rest of his life ranting about the invisible demon that lived in his head. Sadly, the only viable path forward for him at this point is as a raving violent nutbag pooping on a San Francisco street corner, so yeah, the bullet might have been kinder. Anyways, with that dark bit of introspection behind us, and Carter dealt with one way or another, we move on to the final combat arena. And it's a damn good arena. Easily one of the most challenging and enjoyable fights in the game. Though, it is just another combat arena, which is a bit disappointing. For whatever reason, there is no big final boss fight with Origin, which is a letdown given we had some okay ones earlier, like the Space Donut and Axis, and because we never had a chance to have a proper boss fight with Origin back on the Outsider homeworld either. It's not the end of the world though, as again, this arena easily represents the peak of this game's combat system, really pushing you to manage ammo and actively use your abilities to their utmost. But narratively, it makes things feel a bit damp and flat. That's only made worse by the fight then closing with us simply walking through a door into the ending Tron 3000. As was the style at the time, we then get a Fallout-style set of ending slides, going over what happened after we took control of Mosaic and stopped the war, with the overall tone being set by the character we chose back when Carter shunted us out. Angela's version of the ending is brutal and vengeful, forcing the remaining Outsiders to kill each other in an orgy of violence, and then nuking any of their remaining structures or bases. Weir's is hopeful and cooperative, convincing the Outsiders to stop attacking us and instead welcoming them as refugees before helping them back up into the stars to find a new home. And Falk's take on the situation is all cynical government ops, forcing the Outsiders to dismantle or hide all of the gunmetal trash they had built, before then quietly executing them of course, and letting their spaceships burn up in the atmosphere while preserving a few key scientific advancements and shuffling everything else under the rug. No matter whose ending you choose, though, it's made clear that all that truly matters is the lie. That the truth stays hidden and that no one know how close we came to destruction. And the lie holds, because the only one who could truly prove otherwise, the Ethereal, breaks their bonds with whatever host they were inhabiting and disappears off into the unknown. The only other thing in this ending that really changes it all based on your choices is what happens to the Sleepwalkers. If Weir lives to the end of the game and either he or Falk are the host, then the Sleepwalkers will be cured. Otherwise, Angela euthanizes them, or Falk, if he had saved Angie instead, has them cared for, but then they die regardless over time, as they're unable to find a cure without Weir, further justifying my choice from earlier. It's a satisfying enough set of endings, I suppose, though I would say that Falk's feels like the most fitting given the subject matter and overall tone of the game, even if it ends up being a bit more grim than the middle ground would normally imply. That said, as far as we're presented with, they all feel pretty similar, as each ending follows roughly the same formula and uses largely the same slides, just with different moral framings. Just like with that lack of a big final boss fight, it comes off as a bit lame and slapdash, but it's clear by this point, after how much the story has fallen apart, that they never really had a strong idea for how to end things in the first place, and this was a good enough conclusion to ship it and get this game out the door. After all, there was still DLC they needed to finish. Overall, 3 pieces of DLC were released for the Bureau XCOM Declassified, though 2 of them are so light and inconsequential that they hardly bear mentioning. The first would be the Light Plasma Pistol, an extra weapon that if owned unlocks after the second mission, and is basically cheating. That's because it absolutely melts through early game foes, disposing of even the spongiest of mutons with ease and absolutely shattering the balance of this game over its knee. I don't remember ever buying it, and Steam says I don't own it, but I have it in-game anyways for some reason. I believe it was originally a pre-order bonus, so I guess I likely got it that way, before it was then released standalone later on. The second piece of unnecessary fluff that they dared to charge money for is the Codebreakers mission, an extra minor op you can complete as soon as those open up. On its face, it's not a bad piece of content, a fun enough little side mission with a good thematic hook to it, very much in line with the rest of the minor ops in the game. The issue is that it's only 20 minutes long, and offers nothing really all that meaningful or different from what's in the main campaign, to the point that you likely not even notice its additional content when you're playing it. At the very least, it is only $3, which isn't an egregious price, but it is completely unnecessary, and feels like a wasted effort. Like the plasma pistol, this was also a pre-order tchotchke for those who committed early, and in that context it makes more sense, but is still disappointing. Those were but breadcrumbs for the overeager though, and the real meaty post-launch content came in the form of Hangar 6 R&D, a stripped-down prequel campaign to the main story starring Nico da Silva. Now don't get too excited, when I say stripped down, I mean to the bone, as this is basically just an elaborate horde mode. But if you really enjoyed the combat of the Bureau, this gives you more of that in a condensed form with a few new toys to play with. You also get a fun bit of extra narrative on the side that doesn't really answer any questions, but does at least flesh out Nico a tad and nicely dovetails into the main story. The premise here is simple enough. Prior to the Outsider invasion, the nascent Bureau has had one of its agents, Donovan, infected by the Sleepwalker virus, and they're now trying to figure out exactly what's wrong with him. Dresner manages to piece together that there's some sort of psychological element to it, and figures out that they need to connect with the infected agent's mind in order to suss things out. Given it's the cusp of the 1960s and hallucinogenics are all the rage, what better way to do that than with a truckload of drugs? And because Da Silva apparently has a reputation for smoking the jazz cigarettes, he's recruited in to lead the effort. This involves him and a couple of squaddies being sent to an aircraft hangar that's been dressed up to look like a location from Donovan's memories, all while the space is being flooded to the rafters with gaseous LSD. I don't know that the science on what's happening here is exactly sound, but this allows the squad to confront the infected agent's mental demons in a very physical sense, conducting therapy with loaded rifles, taking out the bad thoughts plaguing his mind, which all naturally come in the form of the outsider forces from the main campaign. That's a lot of context for what is ultimately, as I said, a horde mode, with each mission, regardless of the literal set dressing, involving you just gunning down waves of enemies in this small arena while holding down a point or trying to reach a button to hit. It is livened up though by the fact that they go full bore from the start with more challenging enemy formations and increased pressure. This is very much intended as post-game content, and it delivers on utilizing the systems at hand to their fullest. You also get some variance from the way it all played out in the main game, as Da Silva has his own unique suite of abilities built around planting explosive charges and making better use of grenades. You can have him opt to learn some of Carter's tech instead, but frankly that feels like a waste, as Nico's gameplay style offers its own advantages distinct from what you saw in Will's story. Aside from that, you also get a couple of new ballistic weapons to flesh out that side of the toolbox, specifically an AK-47 and a microwave pistol. These are very welcome additions, as the majority of this campaign restricts you just to Earth guns, as remember, we're not actually fighting aliens yet, just drug-induced hallucinations. Of course, as you can imagine, that won't last forever, because while the initial suspect for all of this was the Ruskies, as you keep plumbing Donovan's mind, eventually Mosaic takes notice and starts to reach out to Nico during these psychotropic sojourns. And those little chats make it clear very quickly that Donovan's condition is not just another Soviet trick, but rather the early stages of an alien invasion. In hopes of stopping the outsider threat before it starts, Dresner proposes that we continue the test, using them to hone in on Mosaic's signal to try to create a feedback loop that would force it to disconnect not just from our agent friend, but from any other humans that have been infected so far. Mosaic doesn't take kindly to this though, and eventually gives up with the mental demons and sends in the real ones, kicking off the invasion of Earth early, which is handy because it means we get to use the more powerful alien weapons again for the last few missions of this campaign. And it's implied that all of this is happening at the same time as the attack on Groom Range, and that obviously means we can't just stick around here and continue our drug-fueled love-in, as the Outsiders are tearing up and taking over this base as well. Thankfully though, the aliens aren't familiar enough with Earth to realize that all of these arenas we've been fighting in are just sets. They think they're real, including the one decked out to look like a Soviet missile base. As such, believing it to be a strategic military installation, the Outsiders are focusing their efforts there, allowing De Silva and his team to go down and play along, delaying the enemy long enough to allow the scientists and the civvies on base to escape. The invasion is unrelenting though, and they need a way to disrupt Mosaic for long enough to actually escape themselves, and thankfully they have a plan to do so. More drugs. By flooding the hangar with yet more goofy gas, hitting the Outsider attackers as well as De Silva and his crew, Dresner believes it'll overload Mosaic and give them room to escape, as well as hopefully limit Mosaic's ability to control the infected going forward. Unfortunately though, the strain of this will kill Agent Donovan, as we're inviting an entire war into his head. But it is the only chance we have at striking back during these early key moments in the war against Origin. And luckily, this plan does seem to work, as the spectral, ethereal tentacles we've seen connected to Donovan this whole time slowly fade away, showing the connection has been severed, or at least diminished. And with this opening bloody nose to the Outsider war effort delivered, De Silva and Dresner escape to the safety of the XCOM HQ, and we cut to credits. Hangar 6 R&D somehow manages to simultaneously feel like both a whole lot of effort and sloppily slapped together with scraps. On the one hand, it introduces a lot of new assets, mechanics, and story, all coming together for a very reasonably priced $6. But on the other hand, the game treats this like it's a whole new campaign, equivalent to the main one, when it is just a horde mode, and only a few hours long. That's not to undercut it though, as I actually quite like what's here. On the gameplay front, this bit of DLC really shows the combat systems firing on all cylinders and delivering a proper challenge. And with a lot of the assets, it felt like the designers were getting to stretch their legs and play a bit more with the Americana setting in ways they didn't in the main campaign, even if those new levels feel like they're made of leftover scraps. Admittedly, the story here does end somewhat flatly, but so did Carter's, and this is a prequel, so an unsatisfying narrative conclusion was expected. Put simply, if you enjoy the main game and the combat of the Bureau overall, then I can absolutely recommend Hangar 6, because it is just more of that, but condensed. That said, it is also entirely unnecessary, barely factoring into the larger story and not really offering enough that's new in any major sense to make this worthwhile for those who only mildly enjoyed their time facing off against the Outsider menace. It is cheap at least, so I could hardly fault it on value, and there is a decent amount of content here, but you can see that it was a tertiary effort at best. It launched just 3 months after the main game, and while DLC like this generally goes into production quite some time before its parent title's release, you can still tell that it was rushed out to some degree. Presumably after the Bureau's initial mixed reception and middling sales, 2K wanted to cut their losses, and so Hangar 6 was likely heavily scoped down and pushed out the door for release as soon as it was presentable. Like Homefront the Revolution, you can tell this was a game that, despite all of its rough edges and the trials and tribulations it ran into during development, there were absolutely developers on this project who deeply cared about it, and were determined to see it through to the end. While I doubt the final product truly satisfied anyone's ambitions, whether they were part of the OG 2K Australia team or part of 2K Marin coming in later, there was still passion here that puts the Bureau above other similar 7th gen exercises in IP revival. And just like that latter Homefront, you can see that love clear as day from the credits, which swaps out a rote list of names in the special thanks section for full-on dedications from the team to their friends and families and other assorted loved ones for bearing with them as they embarked on the journey that was making the Bureau. Maybe I'm just a softie for the overworked, God knows I can relate, but you can see the telltale fingerprints of people who bled, sweat, and cried over this game, and I can't help but respect that. But respect is one thing, and a recommendation is another. So the question remains, do I think it's worth going and playing the Bureau XCOM Declassified in this day and age, especially in light of my original feelings on it and what it was initially revealed as? And the answer is yes, I would. After dissecting this game thoroughly and now having the benefit of time, I can see a lot more diamond in the rough here than I used to, though the rough is still certainly present. That said, the uniquely well-realized setting, the surprisingly nuanced character writing, and the incredibly enjoyable gameplay once it gets rolling make it easy to put aside any misgivings I might have about the levels of duct tape that are holding this experience together. Now, would I still say that I'd have preferred the original 2K Australia version of this game that they showed in 2010? Yes. The concept, gameplay style, and aesthetic of 2Kos's initial vision still really appeals to me, and I absolutely consider their XCOM reboot not going forward as a massive missed opportunity. But that doesn't stop me from appreciating the Bureau as well now. Even if it's not what I thought I wanted, there was passion and thought that went into this project, and by and large it paid off, and resulted in a fascinating title all its own. While the Bureau may be the red-headed stepchild of the series at this point, left out of the Ultimate Collection and barely mentioned on 2K's website, I would say that personally, I feel it has more heart and character than the turn-based titles that usurped its fanfare. Though it's certainly not perfect, and Firaxis' efforts are more cogently designed, the Bureau XCOM Declassified is still a damn fine game unfairly hidden in their shadow, absolutely deserving of being dusted off and given a second chance with a fresh set of eyes. A true, genuine cult classic, if there ever was one. Good, sweet God. That is easily the longest review I have ever made, and it's not even close. While the Bureau was certainly a worthy recipient of all those hours worked, man, am I looking forward to not thinking about anything XCOM related for the next little bit. As for what's next on the docket, there will be a coming soon video and a vote to decide the next main game, as there usually is, but it's gonna be delayed out till November so that I can focus on the Halloween video instead. The time remaining before Samhain is certainly a bit too tight for a full video though, so I'll be doing something a bit non-standard there and reviewing a movie instead, though one that is subtly but deeply connected with a major horror gaming staple. Should be a fun change of pace and relatively quick to put together, so expect that at the end of next month. In terms of other channel news, if you saw ads on this video, I likely actually got paid for those for once, because as much as I said I would never get monetized, I learned recently that YouTube was doing it for me anyways, putting ads on my non-copyright flag stuff and even the private podcast for my Ko-Fi supporters. As such, given they were going to pinch fruit from my tree no matter what I did, I figured I might as well at least get my slice of the pie, and finally sign up for their damn partner program. So, sorry for the ads, skip or block them if you feel like it, I totally understand. Speaking of that Ko-Fi podcast, by the way, if you want to support the channel with more than whatever pennies YouTube decides to send my way, please feel free to check that out. That whole thing has been going on for a few months now, so there's a nice backlog of episodes for new supporters to listen to, all available for just $1, with further benefits available at higher tiers. If there's enough demand for it, maybe I'll open things up and start up YouTube memberships or Floatplane as well for that, but for now, if you want to properly patronize the channel, Ko-Fi is where you can do that. And I think that about wraps things up. As always, thanks for watching, keep your eyes on the sky, and have a good one.